Hello everyone, welcome to Translation Lives, and today we are going to talk about the translation of patents.
Перевод жив.
And joining us today is Reychel Feyt, who is going to give you some background about herself and also guide us through this arcane process. Thank you, Reychel, for finding the time to join us and talk about your work.
Thank you for having me.
So, first things first, can you tell us briefly about how you ended up translating this kind of material?
Sure. I've been doing patent-related translation for going on 5 years now. I first became interested in it while I was back in grad school. Right off the bat, when we were working through different types of subject matter for translation and interpretation, I really liked the technical and scientific subject matter. And I noticed that the World Intellectual Property Organization had a fellowship for patent translation with their Patent Cooperation Treaty Translation Division. So I applied for that and succeeded in securing a fellowship and went to Geneva to work with them on that for about 6 months. And afterwards, I was offered a staff position and then continued in that, and now work as an external contractor. And so I was trained at WIPO to translate certain elements of patent applications and continue doing the same. Unfortunately, it has panned out to be just as interesting as I suspected it would be. And even though it is within the sphere of patents, the documents that I deal with are primarily focused on the technical content of the invention. So I got to indulge that interest in scientific and technical subject matter.
So, my first major question for someone coming from someone who has never translated patents and has barely looked at some in my life is, so let's imagine you're your typical translation student about to graduate or who recently graduated, who got some generalist kind of training that we mostly have, where we have worked with different texts, some technical texts, but not some journalism, something else. And it might look like patents is something so specialized, so different from other text types that you would probably need to unlearn many of the things that you learned and learn things anew. Is that correct? Is it easy enough to get into that field? Is there a barrier to negotiate? How much did you have to relearn when you began your fellowship with WIPO?
I mean, there's definitely a learning curve to it, and it is its own distinct sort of subset of language. But I would say it involves less relearning and more so redirecting some skills that you already have. Because even coming in with a generalist training, I think most students would be familiar with the concept that different subject matter domains are going to require different stylistic approach. So anybody, like if you've trained a little bit with even just basic diplomatic documents, maybe a little bit of UN materials, you'll start to see patterns of like, okay, they use this phrase in a very certain way. That's not necessarily how we'd use it in just general language or what you'd see in a news article. And so taking that and kind of ramping it up to the next level. And for the things that I work with, the big focus here is that you're working with technical writing. And getting used to the idea that things that might come across as awkward and unwieldy in a more general context are an appropriate way to state something in a technical writing context. So if you're interested in patents or just scientific and technical work in general, it really will benefit you to start to familiarize yourself with technical writing in whatever languages you work with, and especially in whatever language you're going to be going into, because having an idea of how it should sound, just the general feel of it, is a big part of the battle. And for technical writing, and especially for patents where you get that overlap of legal and technical, the most important thing I would say is a focus on clarity and making sure that you're not introducing ambiguity into the text. And this, like when we're talking about specific translation techniques, I think the most unusual thing that it had me needing to practice was the idea that I should actually stick a little bit more closely to the structure of the source text grammatically than I'm used to otherwise, because obviously we're often trained of like, you don't want to have some sort of awful clunky word for word translation. It's going to come across as poorly done. It's going to be awkward for the target text reader. But for the patents and the patentability reports, there's important meaning that comes from the structure, the concrete order in which things are arranged, and you need to make sure that you understand very clearly, okay, I'm looking at this source text, I can see that this element, is described relating to this one, this adjective specifically relates to this, and making sure that that comes across very clearly in the source text. So, for example, if we're looking at a Russian text, and it's describing maybe a mechanism and it's talking about the parts and it's just a long string of genitive constructions. Outside of technical writing, my instinct would be, all right, let's break this up. Let's maybe use some possessives with an apostrophe S, maybe separate these things a little bit. And so like in this format, inanimate things with apostrophe S, absolutely not. That's a stylistic no-go. And the sort of long strings of the A, of the B, of the C, of the D that I would tend to stay away from in a more general writing context, this can sometimes be the best option in the technical setting, just to be very clear, like this belongs to this. Another thing for this specific domain is that you don't have the ability to kind of break up and reshape the text physically in the way that you might otherwise. Like if you get a really long sentence that works in Russian and might be a little bit unwieldy in English, normally we would want to break that up into smaller, more manageable sentences as long as we weren't disrupting the meaning. But in certain patent contexts, for example, if you're translating the entire like description of a patent and the claims, which are the actual legally binding portion of it, each claim has to be one sentence. So there, like if you go and you break that up into multiple sentences, you're actually affecting like what this person's legal protection is going to be for their patent, and you can really mess things up like that. In other contexts, it's not quite as impactful, but nonetheless, it's better to try to reflect even like the sentence structure in Russian a little bit more in English than you might usually want to.
Great. So, roughly put, you have to be more literal, right? When you
Yes.
patents. But this brings me to a couple of follow-up questions. I'm assuming you have an editor, right? Or like somebody who checks your style.
Yes.
A native English speaker, I'm assuming. I'm just wondering if what have been some of the more interesting conversations you may have had with style editors at WIPO, like things that they told you, no, Rachel, absolutely abandon those ways. You have to write it like this here.
So some of the most interesting ones, I think certainly the ones that were the biggest learning process for me were sort of where you get the overlap between terminology and style. Because both the gift and the curse of the Russian-English pair for patents is that there's an incredible amount of variety. And I know some of my other colleagues who work in other language pairs, they get half their documents each month strictly automotive parts or, strictly semiconductors, whereas with the Russian stuff, it can be mechanical engineering, aerospace, cosmetics, pharmaceuticals, food products, like anything you can imagine. I've seen all sorts of stuff. So you're going through a lot of terminology in a lot of different fields and, processing these materials and trying to figure out what is the appropriate way to say it. And in some fields you get these terms that just don't feel particularly intuitive. But I guess the best summary would be getting used to the appropriate jargon in each technical subfield. and understanding when, okay, here they've got this sounding very vague and that's fine to do. In this case, it requires a little bit more of a specific term. In this case, you know, this thing that we usually translate to maybe aperture or detail in English, we have this specific field and it's got to be something completely different. I think in a broader stylistic sense, if we want to talk about more the legal side of it, becoming familiarized with the documents that WIPO works under, so the Patent Cooperation Treaty itself. In these reports that I translate, it will often quote and refer to the Patent Cooperation Treaty. So recognizing, you know, sometimes they're going to say, oh, this specific article, you know, which states thus and such. So in this case, I was taught, okay, no matter what it says in the Russian, if it's quoting this article, go to that article, just say what it says in the English. Don't try to do this word for word. Just take the appropriate translation from the English document. And sometimes even if they don't quote an article, seeing like, okay, they're talking about this specific concept, this might be referring to a specific article, so I should go and check and see if I can find the best possible translation from this official source.
When you translate a patent, do you always understand what they came up with? I mean, is it essential for you to know how this or that mechanism or procedure works? And if you don't understand, but you feel that you have to know if, you know, this or that is the case, is there a way for you to contact the people who applied for the patent? Is there any feedback mechanism, or you have to rely on just your own acumen?
Understanding helps tremendously. And of course, there have been some fields that I've gone into with a little bit better of a grasp of, some I'm still working to try to understand. And it's certainly, the process involves a lot of research, and especially when you're sitting with a text that's maybe not grammatically particularly clear, it is extra important to try to delve in and see if you can get a better grasp of the technical content to help you piece together what's going on in the text and make sure that you're not misconstruing it. And unfortunately, we don't have a way of getting in touch with the applicants and asking them questions directly, but you do have a lot of materials at your disposal through the application itself. So you'll have a full description in this case in Russian, of what this invention is, what it does. It'll talk about different pre-existing inventions or scientific literature that are similar to this. And then you'll have, in most cases at least, drawings attached to the invention, which can be helpful to varying degrees. Some come with these really great, very detailed schematics. I had a fantastic one for this sort of like folding cardboard element that came with actual photographs of it sort of unfolded and assembled from various angles, that was incredibly helpful in, you know, translating the report on it. And sometimes it's just boxes with numbers in it that tells you absolutely nothing about how it functions. So in that case, it's time to start looking online and finding articles about whatever's confusing to you and trying to get it sorted out.
Perhaps to continue in this vein, would you like to walk us through how you do research, and I don't know what resources you use, what's your workflow?
Sure. So when I get my documents, this is in a little bit of a later stage during the patent application process. So I work mainly with reports that evaluate how much any given invention meets the criteria of patentability. So at this point, what's important in the research sense is that the abstract of this patent has already been translated. So right off the bat, I can pull up some information on WIPO to see the abstract translation. It'll have the full description of the invention on there, and it'll have other reports and documents that have been filed that relate to this report that I'm working on. So at that point, I'll take a look at the abstract, see, you know, what kind of terminology it might include, see how much it relates to the content in the report that I've got, and then I'll start working on the report. And I prefer to go through and just kind of do an initial translation so I can get it all on paper, have something to work with, and then start picking through various sources to get the terminology sorted out. I love a good hard copy dictionary, and the one that I have been a fan of since I've been working there is this Russian English Polytechnic dictionary. And I think that, I mean, the most important thing in using the resources is understanding where their strengths and limits lie, and lots of cross-referencing. And so with this, I like it mainly in the fact that I know it's a well-researched, well-formed collection of technical terms. You get a lot of great sort of longer phrases, word combinations that you might not find in more general usage dictionaries. It's fantastic for, electronic hardware, for mechanical engineering, metallurgy, chemistry, stuff like that. Something like this, not necessarily so great for data processing or internet-based things. You're more likely to get better, more up-to-date resources just online. So this, though, always have it open, always leafing through it to check stuff. I mean, the standard resources that are good in any field, of course, everyone's beloved Multitran, things like Wikipedia.
What's your take on Multitran, by the way? I mean,
I think
time sort of trying to separate the reliable from the more iffy.
Yes, that's always a process. As like with anything, it demands careful review. And when I use it, and I mean, I use it a lot as sort of a baseline, like a jumping off point of, let's see what's on Multitran. I love the subject area specific links at the bottom of entries. So I'll open up a bunch of those if I'm, doing some sort of mechanical engineering thing. I'll open up the technical definitions. If they've got one for mechanical engineering or machining, I'll open that up. Maybe the automotive one, get a bunch of tabs open, see sort of what the different pages are saying, take a look in the Polytechnic dictionary, see what we've gotten there, start to look at other resources online, and just a lot of cross-referencing and seeing, what and where things are being used. But so yeah, those are sort of like the basic level tools I like to use. Beyond that, though, I mean, obviously for my work, looking at other patents is very applicable, but I think that for anybody who's going to be doing technical work, there can be, useful information to be found in documents like this. So Google Patents is a tremendously important tool for me. In particular, it has an advanced search function where in your general search bar, you can either put in a patent identification number or you can just start searching terms. And it has similar syntax rules with regards to like putting things in quotes, doing a minus, all that sort of stuff. But then in the advanced functions, you can set like what office the patent was filed at. So country or region specific offices. You can set the languages. You can specify that you only want international applications, which is maybe going to give you a better option for looking at different translations. And so that's a really great tool for maybe learning about subject matter, checking terminology usage, finding good links to other related documents or to regional patent office information. And then the other big thing that I like to use are industry-specific glossaries. If you can find a bilingual one, that's always great. But monolingual ones, especially like the Schlumberger oil field glossary, is incredibly useful in the gas and oil patents that I work with. Gazprom at least used to have a bilingual glossary. I haven't looked at it in a little while. I know they've been doing what looked like some work on the website, but that one was quite useful. And yeah, so just whatever, if you're working with some technical subject matter, really looking for industry specific, maybe associated with known organizations, websites that are going to have good glossaries that even if it can't provide you with translations, can give you good definitions of what terms mean. And then you can start comparing definitions of things in different languages to make sure that, the terms that you're trying to use actually line up in their usage. And sometimes from like universities, they'll have web pages associated with courses or departments that might have easily available articles that provide good, clear explanations. So no, definitely using like good, reliably sourced articles and encyclopedias is incredibly useful.
I'm assuming at your organization you have to use translation memory tools or not.
varies. The desire in the
about it.
department is there to use them. The main issue then becomes we don't always get documents and document formats that work great with that. I know some of my colleagues, I believe like in the German to English section, I think everything they do in Trados. And I think my Chinese colleague also does the same, like everything is in CAT tools. Unfortunately for us, abstract translation we do through Trados and World Server, which can vary in its helpfulness because again, abstracts tend to be a single sentence. Maybe it'll be one sentence at the beginning that's like, this relates to the field of mechanical engineering, and then one long sentence that describes the entire invention. So it can be hit or miss on how helpful translation memory is with that. Unfortunately for the reports, we are still receiving PDFs, non-readable PDFs. And so I just have a PDF open on one side and a Word template on the other, and it's we're doing it like that. I think that the idea is that we'll move towards doing everything in CAT tools in the future. And I think it'll be incredibly useful for the reports, but we haven't quite gotten there yet for the Russian section, at least.
I know it's a bit of a hypothetical thing because you haven't yet moved there, but why do you think it's going to be so helpful? I mean, I'm just wondering, is it just going to be your individual translations in that translation memory that you're going to use, in which case, obviously, it can be very helpful, or everyone, every translator who is in the Russian section, in which case, what are you going to do? Or have you had these experiences where a translation memory tool would suggest something that you disagree with, and you have to make this call whether to use it or to argue against it, and what's the right decision in this or that situation?
So I think I know at least in the past, when I've used the translation environments for WIPO, it has been a collective one. And so when I was doing abstracts in-house, it would be just all the abstracts that we've done in the department were put into this translation memory. And we had a subdivision of the translation department that specializes in translation technology and making sure that that's all working smoothly and integrated well. And so as far as I know, even external translators get to use translation memories and glossaries that deal with the full body of work that WIPO processes. And I think the greatest benefit comes from having the glossary capabilities and built-in terminology options. I mean, because you have plenty of options out there, but this again just sort of streamlines the process and will give you hopefully some good suggestions to start your research from, because research will still be an inevitable and important component. And certainly in the past when I have used CAT tools, there would be some questionable suggestions sometimes, not necessarily due to poor translations that were put into the memory, but for words like соединение or corpus or something like that, that can mean so many different things in so many different contexts. And because of the vast variety that we get in the Russian-English pairing, the memory is going to be suggesting all kinds of things that are not necessarily useful or applicable in even a majority of situations. It can be very hit or miss. So I think there's special difficulties that come into play due to the vast number of subject domains that we deal with in Russian. But since there is a lot of review put into the translations we receive, I think it has the potential to provide a solid base, give you some good options to start your research from. And then when you get into aspects that relate more to the formulaic phrases in these documents, to things that refer to the patent cooperation treaty or other WIPO documents, that's going to pop up in the memory very cleanly, very nicely, and you're not that'll take out a little bit of having to look up the articles and make sure you've copied it correctly. And I think that could offer some nice streamlining options.
Mm-hmm. You've mentioned соединение, corpus. Can you give us some more examples of perhaps the terms that give you the most grief, or something that you initially struggled with, or just some interesting cases from your experience where something was especially challenging or interesting or worthy of your attention in some way?
Well, the big one that they introduce to you when you start to train is выполнен с возможностью. You see this everywhere in the reports, and it'll be some sort of component выполнен с возможностью чего-то, and it looks really weird and awkward if you try to bring it just directly into English. It sounds terrible. But the idea here is that it is configured in a specific way. So you can, in certain instances, if it's like выполнен с возможностью вращения, it's rotatable, and you could just condense that right down to rotatable. Or if it doesn't have that sort of clean transition into a nice single adjective, configured so as to be capable of, configured such that, or so as to, and then you take what you've got afterwards and build a separate clause. And выполнение can be design or configuration. That's one of the ones that can vary a lot based on the context. One that I always hate is technologически, because whatever it's going to be, it's certainly not going to be technological. And it can sort of vacillate so wildly in some situations. A lot of times it's going to be referring to some kind of process, like process procedure or manufacturing process or process steps. If it's describing something physical, like I think I've seen технологическое отверстие would be like a service port or a service opening. And so if it's something structural, it's maybe going to be relating to getting in and providing service to whatever this thing is. If it's relating to the process, it's going to be process or procedure or something like that. But it's always like, okay, now I've got to stare at this and figure out what sort of weird phrase it's going to turn into. And certain things that I find funny, it's certain words in Russian I think are very clear and evocative, and when you take whatever prefix it's got, whatever other elements are built into it, it provides this very sort of distinct image of like, okay, I know I can see what kind of process is happening here, and then it's like there doesn't seem to be a clean, clear way to say this in English, or there's no equivalent that feels quite as crisp and evocative as what the Russian is. And one that always sort of amused me in that sense was выделение, and seeing like just like you're doing it out, it's выделение, but what is the context? Is it going to be separation or extraction or isolation? Or again, you have to look at like, okay, we're dealing with maybe materials, with gases, like what's happening here. One that can sometimes have interesting constructions around it, and sometimes necessitates more sort of shuffling of the language than you might often see in this type of writing, is воздействие. And seeing, so usually it's either going to be action or exposure, and especially if you're talking in the context of radiation, that you're probably talking about, exposing something to this type of radiation for a certain amount of time, or in chemical reactions that there's maybe like one element acting upon another, and that can be highly situational. And I find that one doesn't have quite the same range that some other words can have, but you definitely have to really sit down, look at like, okay, what's the process happening here? What's going to be the most appropriate way to say it?
Thank you. This is very fascinating to hear. What about maybe some prepositions? Like, for example, does it happen that some structures or some prepositions are just too vague and you have to, I don't know, guess at what exactly was meant, or I don't know, take a pot shot? Like, for example, по or pri. I don't know how much this happens in patents, but something действующее при чем-то can mean a wild variety of things, on the premises of, or under the general umbrella of, or по seems to be able to link any two nouns or ideas, and still there's a case for using по. Do you encounter some things that are annoyingly vague in Russian, where you have to, keep guessing at what was the specific meaning in this or that context?
Of the prepositions, I think that por can tend to be the trickiest, because in a lot of cases it's, it's a fairly clear cut, like, okay, it's clearly, doing something according to, or sort of in the sense that one would expect. But sometimes you're looking at it like that doesn't make sense. There's no way that fits together, and so you have to look into other options of, like, under the definition of, or things that you might associate more with instrumental case prepositions than I guess maybe a native English speaker might associate with por. Pri is usually a fairly agreeable one to work with. There are a number of phrases that can be a good option for translation. And most of the instances when I see it, it tends to be describing sort of a temporal concept of either that, like, you're going through a process, and that while you're carrying out this step of the process, this is happening, or that it needs to be, you're doing this and it has to be at this specific temperature, or once something has occurred, pri being the sort of signifier of, like, this thing has happened or begun, now you have to do this or you'll receive this result. That one I think is it hinges a lot on the context in which you see it, but I find it tends to be pretty easy to figure out, like, okay, what's a viable way to present this in English. Something I've found interesting with vo and na is that you have to be very careful of seeing what case is it taking afterwards, because it is important to mark, like, okay, is this a stationary thing that we're describing here, or are we describing movement from one thing into another? Because sometimes it seems like, oh, that should be intuitive, you should be able to see it in the process, but in some instances you could very easily use both and it would mean a very different thing in the context of the mechanism or process that's being described. In certain cases, I'm not entirely sure if it is a meaningful choice or just a choice done on the whim of the person who wrote this document. I was doing, I think, a data processing, data transfer based invention, and talking about, like, different processors, different devices, and, like, передача данных, and sometimes it's в устройстве, and it's like, okay, it seems like they're saying the exact same thing in both of these cases, and I have to really sit down and pick through, like, is this difference in stationary versus movement significant, or is it just they kind of forgot that they did it one way the last time and now they're doing it the other way for flavor? So
in Russian, I think especially in more bureaucratic or in technical language, we use these I don't know, compound words a lot, like технико, научный, научно-технический, водно-гипсовый, whatever you want to combine, you can do that and come up with this compound adjective, for example, or a noun. It seems that when these things are translated into English, unless we're talking about the few words that have traditional equivalents, it's mostly something and something. Is that the pattern that you usually use, or have you come up with something else?
That is very often the solution to it. In some cases, if it can function as a nice compound word in English, of course, we like to go with that. But yeah, if it's unwieldy, and especially if I see something I haven't seen before and it's not really turning up any results for the compound in English, you just, break it into two words.
Is it easy? Is it feasible enough for somebody who's who graduated from a teen high school to go into the field of translating patents? What would you say one would do to probably become a freelancer or intern somewhere? Is WIPO the only real gateway to this world, or what's your experience in this field?
I know the WIPO is definitely a very good gateway into it, and I think first and foremost in that they provide training to you. You're not just launched in with the expectation of, like, you need to know how to do this, you need to be churning out perfect patentability reports, like, do it or you're out the door. And they do have a very well developed and very supportive training process to make sure that you start to pick up the skills that you need to do this. But it's certainly not the only way into the field and not the only body to work with, because WIPO essentially functions to facilitate a central international filing for patents and make it easier for people and cheaper for applicants to be able to get patents in a lot of different countries. But it's still absolutely possible for people to file patents directly with their national office or regional office with no intention of going on to WIPO. And even when filing with WIPO, the regional offices are still very important. So like on the national level, working with the US Patent and Trademark Office or the Russian Patent Office, they have their own separate translation needs from the reports that come through for WIPO. And I think quite a few people out there who translate freelance within the patent sphere, and especially who do more of the legal side of it, or maybe do like the full descriptions and the claims on patents. They work through a different pipeline than I do. And there are language service providers out there who specialize in IP materials and working in the IP process. I know there's one at the moment. Morningside used to be a big figure in that field, and I believe it's Questel that has acquired them. I know there's been like a lot of sort of acquisition and shakeups related to that. But Questel is a company that does a lot of IP related stuff, both for applicants and filing and all sorts of things, but also for language services. And they do prior art translation, they do patent translation. So certain language service providers will be good options to go through. And sort of interesting concept that I've been thinking more about since going to the American Translators Conference this year is the idea of going to conferences that don't fall within our field. Like if you want to do legal translation, if you have a specific subtype, if you like patent translation, or if you're really interested in industrial translation, in doing manuals for machinery and doing pharmaceutical translation, go to conferences within the pharmaceutical industry or to like whatever your national patent lawyer association's meetups are. Like if you can sign up to go to that, you're going to be able to learn a lot of interesting things regarding the subject material, and you're going to be able to meet people in the field who might have a need for your services or might be able to point you to somebody who could, who'd be interested in hiring you. So I think for trying to get into that field, it can be a tricky way in, but I think figuring out like, okay, what sort of technical subject matter do I want to do? Or if I'm going to do patents, like, great, let's start learning about patents. Let's start looking into different organizations and companies that might offer venues to do this work. And it never hurts to build a baseline of technical knowledge. I know that a lot of the people that I worked with at WIPO actually really spoke about the benefits of doing just a technical writing course for, a course aimed at people who would maybe be going into academia or writing in these industries, just again, to get a strong grip of what is this supposed to sound like in my target language.
Перевод жив.
Perhaps my last question is there something else you would like to tell us about your work? Something that I maybe forgot to ask, but you wanted to share?
The technical field, patents, of course, but I think that the technical field is so incredibly interesting, and it's easy to like clump it together as this just big like machines and science, but there's such a tremendous diversity of subject matter that as long as it's one of those things that I think if you decide you want to go into this, the slow process of entry won't necessarily hurt, because I think it's important to really get a feel for like, how much do you like this on a personal level? Because you're going to be spending a lot of time slogging through dictionaries and articles and trying to like understand all these different concepts. And of course, if you find that just fundamentally tedious and aggravating, that's a sign to maybe think about. But on the other hand, it can be so incredibly fascinating and exciting in some instances to get to come into contact with these new ideas, with these things that people are working on. And for as much as, sometimes the subject matter that we deal with in a variety of fields can be a little bit soul crushing, a little bit depressing. I think it's exciting to be able to sit down and look at, like, wow, look at this cancer treatment that they're developing, and this new antiviral, and look at this cool little tea maker that this person made. I want to get one of those. So no, it's if it turns out to be something that you like, it's an incredibly rewarding and fun at times subject field to delve into.
Thank you so much for this very interesting and uplifting conversation.
Перевод жив.